Hi, I'm Rochelle Gentile, president of the Dubuque Symphony Orchestra League. I'm here at the Dubuque Golf and Country Club, kicking off our virtual Soundbites series. Under normal circumstances, you'd be right here with me, enjoying a great lunch and a preview of the DSO's upcoming concert, and I'm sure you will be again soon. As you may know, the DSOL develops and administers projects, programs, and events that provide music education opportunities to folks of all ages, as well as financial support to the DSO and its youth ensemble programs. Each year, the League contributes support to youth education events and programs such as the 3rd and 5th grade Arts Trek concerts, the 4th grade Adopt a Musician program, the Youth Concerto competition, the Dubuque Symphony Youth Ensembles, and the Summer String Camp. Along with our many other endeavors is our Senior Classics program, now in its 9th year, providing performances by DSO musicians to entertain residents and their families at local nursing homes and assisted living centers. While the past year has looked a little different, we continue to focus our efforts on fundraising. We encourage and welcome you to join us in our 54th year of supporting the DSO. Please check out the DSO's website for more information about how you can get involved. We hope to see you soon, but before I go, I'd like to introduce our esteemed music director and conductor, Dr. William Intriligator.
Thank you, Rochelle, and welcome everybody. Today I'd like to talk to you about Mozart's Symphony No. 41, the Jupiter Symphony as it's known. That nickname was not coined by Mozart himself. In fact, it was probably attached to this symphony long after Mozart died. Some researchers say that a concert promoter in London named Johann Solomon gave this title to the symphony when he was trying to promote a concert of it there. This was the same concert promoter in London who actually invited Haydn to London and for whom Haydn wrote his London symphonies. But I'm getting a little far afield. The Jupiter Symphony of Mozart is his last symphony. It's Symphony No. 41. When he wrote this in August of 1788, he was just 32 years old, and he didn't know it would be his last symphony, I think. There is a lot of mystery surrounding why he wrote this symphony and symphonies number 39 and 40. Like we don't know why it's called the Jupiter, we don't know why Mozart wrote these 3 symphonies in very quick succession in the summer of 1788. Normally, we have a really good document of Mozart's writing, and because he wrote letters to his father especially, but even to others too, and explaining what he was doing, telling all the details of his life. I think his father had passed away not too long before this, and so it's unfortunate that, with his father, he would sometimes share all these details about, I'm writing this for this occasion or for this person who commissioned it. Now, remember, Mozart would write for specific occasions or commissions and needing the money, and he rarely would just write for the pure pleasure of writing. Because he didn't have a letter to his father explaining why he wrote this, there is no history, and we know so much about Mozart's history and life through letters and other documents, but nothing about this. These 3 symphonies, numbers 39, 40, and 41, were written extremely quickly and were written one after the other in this summer, and it's likely that Mozart never heard them performed. That's the other thing. Why would he go to the trouble of spending, 8 weeks or something in that summer writing these 3 symphonies if he didn't have a performance opportunity for them? Even a deeper mystery is why Symphony No. 40 has 2 versions, one without clarinets and then one with clarinets. Maybe he did get a performance of Symphony No. 40 and he wanted to use the newfangled clarinets. Well, these are some of the mysteries surrounding this piece. As we perform this in our Classics 4 concert coming up, one of the things I'd like you to keep in mind is that this piece has a wonderful balance of ceremony and charm and surface beauty, and yet it also has intensity into it. It has that balance in a unique way. And part of it is that Mozart was really poring over the scores of Johann Sebastian Bach during and around this time, even earlier in the 1780s as well. And Bach's use of counterpoint, the art of putting different musical lines together, fascinated Mozart. In most of Baroque music, not just Johann Sebastian Bach, counterpoint is an essential part of the musical expression. But in Mozart's era, the so-called classical era of classical music, counterpoint wasn't as, I guess, intense or essential to the musical expression. Great composers like Mozart, Haydn, and others in the classical era, of course, were extremely well versed at counterpoint. It was part of their sort of training, and and it was part of how to put together great pieces of music. But suddenly, with this piece, Symphony Number 41, Mozart decides to make counterpoint one of the defining elements of musical expression. It's rare in the classical era to have that. I believe that he was searching for more intensity in his music. In Symphony Number 40, the one right before this symphony, and the one that Mozart composed, just sort of in that same summer, in a way, these three symphonies kind of all speak to each other. They sort of have hints of foreshadowing the others and references to the others in a way that's almost like he created a meta symphony that would be these three symphonies, perhaps even to be performed together, which is rarely ever done. But Symphony Number 40 is particularly extroverted in its passions and intensity. It's a minor keyed symphony, and its heart is out there, and it's just so intense and tragic. Perhaps with Symphony Number 41, Mozart was seeking to find a little bit of balance to that, finding, in a sense, an element of intellectualism, this counterpoint, to bring a different kind of intensity than he had in Symphony Number 40. Let's listen to a little bit of the opening. This is a great example of a C major piece by Mozart. In C major, oftentimes pieces start with a lot of pomp and ceremony. Let's listen to it. Unusual that he actually comes to a stop just 38 seconds into the symphony. And then he continues with something you might not expect. He continues with already sort of developing the theme. One of the things that's also unusual about this symphony is that he presents themes that are not as necessarily fancy or sublime and overtly beautiful as some of his other pieces. He presents more basic themes. And with them, he's constantly developing them, changing them, and evolving them. So the process of musical development, which sometimes has been, reserved for, a couple minutes into a movement, after we've heard all the themes, then things develop. That would be more customary. What's happening here is that right away there's development. Right away things are changing. In fact, one of the unusual things about this symphony is that at the beginning of each of the four movements, a theme is presented, and then it's immediately repeated, ascended just one whole tone higher. Let's listen to that again. We'll hear it in this first movement, how it starts, and then it rises a little bit. Okay, here we go. Musically, it's a little higher. I find it curious that happens in each of the movements, that a theme is presented and then almost immediately presented a little bit higher. It's like as if he's searching, striving toward heaven, Now, I don't want to make too much of it. I think what he's trying to maybe express is that things aren't going to stay where they are for very long. And they're going to evolve and change and maybe even falter right away. So there's this sense at the very beginning of this symphony, and in fact in the beginning of each of the four movements, that things change right away. Things are not going to be repeated verbatim. This is really interesting because in a lot of Mozart's music, and music in the classical era in general, it reflected a philosophy from the Enlightenment that although things might change, the world itself is never going to really drastically change, and that it will always come back. In a sense, the whole idea of what we call sonata form in music, where themes are presented and then developed and evolved and then come back to the way that they were, perhaps subtly changed, but not hugely changed. That was, in a sense, a defining element of this so-called sonata form, which was so popular and evolved, in the classical era. Now, later, composers, Beethoven, others would make it so, yes, we know that things don't come back to the way they were. Revolutions were happening, worlds were changing. But this was 1788. Yes, it was a time of revolution politically in France and other places, and certainly in the United States, the soon-to-be United States, or recently United States. But overall, there was this worldview in a lot of Mozart's music, earlier music, where things would be presented and then developed and then come back to the way they were. Here, in Symphony number 40, we have constant development from right away. And when they come back, they are changed, and they're not the same. This movement, the first movement, has three main theme areas. The second theme is a lot different than the first. People have said that the first is bold and masculine, and the second is very feminine and sly. And, well, yes, it has that different quality. And the third theme is even different, too. It's sort of playful and silly. I'm going to try to find that second theme for you here. Here it is. Passing the theme. First is in the violins, then the cello's repeated. Now a bassoon is joined in. There's constant development. And you have this little ba-di-da-di-da-di-da-di, which is like the Alberti bass line in a piano sonata. Cellos take over. Now this is just pure Mozart, isn't it? Well, what's also pure Mozart is the tragedy that's waiting right around the corner. Shocking. Things come back. But maybe they don't. Let's talk about that moment of tragedy. It's one of the most dramatic moments in the whole symphony. The music is playfully moving along, and suddenly there's a silence. And you know that the greatest composers wrote the greatest silences. Everything stops, and we don't know what's happening. Suddenly the veil is lifted, and the ceremony of this Jupiter symphony is, we reveal the emotions underneath, what's maybe really going on. And there is this sense of tragedy, but it only comes in for so briefly. It's so fascinating. But that will happen again in later movements. We'll talk about that. The third theme is this lovely little theme that was an aria that he wrote called Il Bacio di Mano, a kiss of the hand. And it's almost like a closing theme. It becomes an important part of the development section. There is an actual development section, even though we've already been developing the themes early on. And it takes it to an extreme. In the first movement, it presents the idea of intense counterpoint between upper voices and lower voices, something that's setting the stage for the last movement, which is the greatest example of symphonic counterpoint in any symphony ever written. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So you've got this constant evolution of the themes. It's constantly changing. You've got pomp and you've got grace, but you've also got glimpses of tragedy. All these different things are contributing to the intensity of this piece. The second movement starts as with the opposite of intensity. It's just a simple theme. Listen to this. Oh, but we're going to raise it at a step, like I told before. All these silences. We don't know what's happening next. Suddenly, he drops us into one of these gorgeous moments like an aria from an opera. It's that Shawshank Redemption-like moment when that Mozart is played over the speakers in that film in the prison. Gorgeous. Simple, but beautiful. Now the cellos and basses play the theme from the beginning. The violins add a wonderful little sort of see-through arabesque. Raising it again. Now it feels at this point that we're sort of settled into this movement. And it's right about this time that Mozart wants to pull the wool out from us and bring us into something incredibly tragic and dark again. And here it comes. You think everything's fine, and then all of a sudden, the music is off kilter, it's syncopated. And there's this bada, 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 bada. It's just sort of like stumbling. And then the rhythm is so far off, and it goes into really tragic moments. I mean, this is Don Giovanni, which had just premiered 3 months before he wrote this. That same feeling of Don Giovanni, that tragic, almost like the ghosts and macabre. What is this doing in this otherwise very lovely middle movement? The sort of calmer theme comes back. This is just another great example of the way Mozart is constantly changing the feeling of it. Here in the year 2021, those tragic moments might not sound as tragic because of all of the music and sounds that we've experienced since then. But in 1788, this was intense, this was dark, this was that tragic sound. It's so dramatic for that time. Fascinating, so great. The dissonances in this movement are just incredible, but if you listen to them with the ear that we have of hearing dissonances in later composers, we might miss them. We might not appreciate just how pungent and poignant they are. The third movement of this symphony is a minuet, like a lot of the third movements of Mozart symphonies. Let's listen to the opening. The first section is repeated. This is the overall plan of a minuet. You have 2 sections and they're both repeated. And then there's a whole separate thing called the trio with 2 sections that are repeated, and then we go back to the minuet. You probably noticed that the main theme is presented and then presented a step higher. Now we're in the second section of the minuet. Suddenly that bit of pomp from the opening of the first movement comes in again. The music keeps trying to get higher and higher, even though the theme itself is descending. And then something very unusual happens here. just the woodwinds play in this melting, incredible counterpoint moment. Now we're going to repeat this whole second section. I'm going to just pause this for a moment here. One of the things I find fascinating is that the theme itself is descending, da 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 da, but he keeps trying to make it ascend by going ba da 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 ba da 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 ba da da da. And that happens right away in the first section, but then in the second section he takes it to the next extreme. And then he gives it to the woodwinds, who then just let it melt, and they bring it down, down, down. It's fascinating. The theme itself is so simple, just these descending notes. But it also makes me think of that second theme of the first movement, which was also simple, but just ascending, when it was just ba-da-dum. Here he's giving us that opposite, ba-da-dum. That's the beginning of this thing. So you see how there's interrelationships between the movements as well. It's fascinating. After this second section is repeated, we go on to the trio. And the trio has some musical jokes in it, and it also foreshadows the fourth movement. Let's hear it. Here's the end of the second section. Oh, we get the, oh yeah, here's the woodwind melting part again. He took the last two notes from the end of the first, the minuet. A lot of times this trio section of a movement called a minuet is lighter and daintier like this and using less forces. And he does that, but he also has a sort of musical joke here by starting it with a dissonance that resolves and then answered by kind of a main statement. It's sort of the flipped opposite order of what you might normally expect. What also is interesting is that this is exactly what Beethoven does in the very first measure of his very first symphony. He starts with a musical joke with this same kind of exact kind of dominant chord, which is like an unresolved chord, and then it resolves. And so perhaps when Beethoven wrote his first symphony, he may have known this piece and written that as a sort of homage. Now, at the next moment in this trio section, we get a very forceful display. It's suddenly loud. And what we're going to hear is really a foreshadowing of the simple four-note motif that is the first motive of the fourth movement. Ba-da-dee-da. Let's give a little listen. Here we go. Oh, it leads right back seamlessly into that beginning. Fascinating. All right, so then after that section's repeated, we go back to the beginning of the minuet, and we do both parts. That's how a minuet works, a minuet and trio. Now, the last movement is amazing. This last movement is perhaps the greatest example of Mozart trying to do counterpoint to the extreme. And why is he doing it? And it's been said that this is probably the greatest example of counterpoint in any symphony ever written. It's probably true. What he does is he presents very short little fragmented themes. They're not long and they're not like overly developed. What he does is he presents all these little fragments of themes, and then he immediately has them repeated in canon or flipped upside down or in imitation, or he combines them. And what's incredible is that in the coda of this last movement, he combines 5 themes in counterpoint, some of them in inversion, and it's just mind-blowing. If you were to analyze this and sit down and intellectually analyze it, you would, your mind would blow. And there's some actually great videos you should watch on YouTube that show with the score, and show all the counterpoint. So if you type in YouTube something like finale of Mozart's Jupiter Symphony counterpoint revealed or something like that, you'll find some fascinating videos. But let's talk a little bit about why does he do this? Why is there such incredible counterpoint? Well, I mentioned it at the very beginning. I think that he is trying to get a different kind of intensity to his music. And he's exploring this. He's exploring bringing back this idea of old-fashioned Baroque counterpoint and bringing something old-fashioned back into the symphony for added variety and intensity. The idea of counterpoint brings up another thing, which is the idea of sort of craftsmanship in music. Great composers, one of the reasons that they're great is that their music is incredibly well crafted, meaning that they will present a theme and then vary it in a certain brilliant way. This idea of musical craftsmanship you can trace from Bach to Mozart to late Beethoven to Brahms, and Brahms had it unbelievably, and then to Schoenberg and 12-tone music. There's a sense, a lineage of craftsmanship in music where this almost intellectual approach to writing music can be traced from way back up until the 20th century and even to today. And composers have been doing this not to try to prove how smart they are, but to try to show a kind of musical architecture that stays together and musical expression that isn't just hard on your sleeve. It's to give depth to the music. It's to give intensity. I keep going back to that word. It's all about the intensity. You know, the great composers had equal balance between heart and mind, in their music. It wasn't just emotional. There was also this well-crafted intellectual approach as well. So I think that's what's going on here. Let's listen to a little bit of the opening of this fourth movement. It sounds so light, nice, and chipper. Why is William talking about it being intellectual? Oh, well, that's on the surface of things. You really don't have to know anything about the counterpoint or intellectualism to appreciate this music. It's great music, and you don't have to analyze it. You don't have to think about it. It's just, it has that perfect balance of, beauty and emotion, but also intellectual rigor. So here you can already hear that he's using that opening theme as a subject of a mini fugue. Second theme. And here's the third theme. You can hear he's already doing it right away, one after another. It's like a cannon. Row your boat, row your boat, row your boat. He does that with these themes where one voice will be doing it, the other voice will start doing it like a beat later, and then another voice will do it a beat later. What a blessing it is that we have this gift that Mozart shared this. Really, an example of one of the greatest achievements of all mankind we're listening to right now. This is the Sistine Chapel ceiling, but in music, perhaps. One of these great accomplishments. It's very moving, actually. What is Mozart trying to tell us? Such incredible music. Now, I am going to jump toward the end so you can hear the part with the quintuple counterpoint. You can hear many themes combined. So let's just hear that for a moment. what we call the coda in music, the tail part. Everything gets very mysterious and calm. How will we end this? And suddenly, all these things together. Challenge to himself to do that. And then it just comes back for an incredible, glorious finish. Was Mozart trying to just challenge himself intellectually and musically by doing all these themes together and finding a way to do it brilliantly, maybe even secretly without his regular lay audiences even understanding it? Maybe. Was he consciously or subconsciously trying to find more intensity in his music? Yes, I think so. I think he was trying to find a new kind of intensity, a new kind of expression in a symphony. You know, this is an early example of when the last movement of a symphony might have more importance than the earlier movements. For so long in symphonies, the first, second, and third movements, the first movement was the intense part. The second movement, a beautiful, slow movement. Third movement, light, like a minuet. And the last movement was also light for many, many years. And this is maybe the first step toward that evolution that would happen in the Romantic era, starting especially with Beethoven's Eroica Symphony just 20 years later, when Beethoven wrote that in like 1802. And so this is a shift in the symphony where the importance is given toward the end. Of course, one of the greatest examples is Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And every symphony written after that has had such an important finale, where the finale sums it all up. Mozart sums it up in this finale, what he's been trying to do throughout all the earlier movements. He's giving us constant development, showing that the world is not going to stay the same, that it's constantly changing, but that it can do so in these brilliant, wonderful, exciting ways. Let's also not forget that when Mozart wrote this piece, he, like all the composers before him, was writing for that time. They did not write for posterity. It wasn't until later, most importantly with Beethoven and later, that composers had this idea that their music would live on after they died. Mozart was writing this for that time, but yet he's reaching forward to us in the year 2021, or whenever you listen to this piece, and showing us a glimpse of what was going on in his world and in his heart and mind at that time in 1788. Fascinating and beautiful. I hope you'll enjoy this Jupiter Symphony, Symphony number 41 by Mozart. Thank you.